December 11th, 1978. John F. Kennedy, International Airport, New York. Just before 3 in the morning, a black Ford Econoline van pulls up outside Building 261, the Lufthansa cargo terminal. 6 men climb out. One of them knows the building by heart. His name is Louis Werner, and 3 years earlier he worked inside these walls as a cargo supervisor. He owes money to bookies, more than he can pay, and he has been talking to a man named Jimmy Burke about a way out. Burke is a career criminal out of the Roberts Lounge crew in South Ozone Park, a man the FBI calls Jimmy the Gent because he tips well and never raises his voice. He has spent months collecting details from Werner, the shift schedule, the vault combination, the exact minute the night guards change. Tonight, all of it gets used. 2 men in ski masks force their way through an employee entrance. Inside, they round up 9 workers at gunpoint and march them to a lunchroom. No shots are fired, no alarms are triggered. The gang knows exactly where the cash is, because Werner told them. In the vault sit stacks of American currency, flown in from a Lufthansa flight out of West Germany, along with a smaller haul of jewellery. The men load duffel bags for exactly 64 minutes. By the time they drive away, they have taken $5 million in cash and roughly $1 million in jewellery, the largest cash robbery in American history at that point. No guns are drawn against employees beyond the initial threat. No one is physically hurt inside the building. The van disappears into the pre-dawn streets of Queens, and for a moment, the perfect crime looks finished. What nobody in that lunchroom knew was that the plan had been built for weeks around one floor. Too many people would eventually know too much. Jimmy Burke did not intend to share $5 million evenly, and he did not intend to leave loose ends breathing. The crew includes men with names investigators would later trace one by one: Angelo Sepe, Tommy DeSimone, Joe Manry, Robert McMahon, Louis Kafora, and a getaway driver named Stax Edwards, whose job was simple: ditch the van in a spot where it would not be found for weeks. Edwards does not do this. Instead, he parks it in a tow zone in Brooklyn, and by the next afternoon, police have already recovered it, dusting the interior for prints that will later matter enormously. Burke is furious. Within days, the robbery that made headlines for its size starts making headlines for something else. The men who pulled it off begin disappearing. Edwards is found shot to death in his apartment on January 18th, 1979, just over a month after the heist. Then, one by one, the others follow. Joe Manry and Robert Mahon are found shot inside a car in Brooklyn in May. Louis Kafora and his wife vanish entirely. Their bodies are never located. Tommy DeSimone, a hot-tempered associate later portrayed on screen as a man who kills without hesitation, disappears in January 1979, and his body is never found either. Angelo Sepe survives longer than most, but even he is gunned down years later outside his home, in what investigators believe is retaliation tied to the same string of killings. Because of this pattern, a chilling theory takes hold inside federal investigators' offices. Jimmy Burke is systematically eliminating everyone connected to the Lufthansa job, keeping the money for himself and a small inner circle, and making sure no one lives long enough to talk. 6 to 8 murders, by some estimates, trace back to the aftermath of a single overnight robbery. This becomes one of the reasons the Lufthansa heist earns its place in true crime history. Not simply the theft itself, but the body count that follows it. The FBI, led out of its New York field office, assigns agents to the case almost immediately, and Louis Werner becomes the first real break. His fingerprints and his known gambling debts point investigators straight to him within weeks. He is arrested, tried, and convicted in 1979 for his role as the inside man, one of the only members of the actual heist crew to be convicted specifically for the Lufthansa robbery itself. Jimmy Burke is a different problem. Investigators know he orchestrated the killings that followed the heist, and they strongly suspect he planned the robbery from the start. but proving direct involvement in the Lufthansa job itself is difficult. What ultimately brings Burke down is not the heist. It is a separate case, the fixing of college basketball games at Boston College, tied to point-shaving schemes run through his associates. In 1982, Burke is convicted in that case and sentenced to 20 years. Then, in 1985, he is convicted separately for the murder of Richard Eaton, a man found frozen inside a meat truck, a killing connected to a cocaine deal gone wrong, rather than to Lufthansa directly. Burke receives a life sentence for that murder. He is never formally convicted for his role in planning the Lufthansa robbery, despite investigators' near certainty that he was its architect. He dies in prison in 1996 of lung cancer, taking whatever he knew about the missing $5 million with him. The man whose story eventually blows the case wide open publicly is not Burke, and not Werner. It is Henry Hill, a lower-level associate in the Lucchese crime family who becomes a government informant in 1980 after his own arrest on drug charges. Hill knows the Lufthansa crew personally. He grew up alongside many of them at Robert's Lounge, Burke's headquarters bar in Ozone Park. Hill's cooperation with the FBI, and later his 1985 memoir written with journalist Nicholas Pileggi, becomes the primary public account of what happened that December night, and in the murderous months that followed. That memoir, titled Wise Guy, becomes the basis for a 1990 feature film that turns the Lufthansa heist into one of the most recognizable crime stories in American culture, cementing names like Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, and Tommy DeSimone into the public imagination, even though most of the men who actually walked into that cargo building were never convicted for it. Because here is the fact that makes Lufthansa different from almost every other major heist in American history. Despite $5 million in stolen cash, despite a trail of at least 6 related murders, despite a federal investigation that ran for decades, almost none of the money was ever recovered, and almost none of the participants were ever convicted specifically for the robbery itself. Werner goes to prison for his role as the inside informant. A handful of Burke's known associates face other charges over the following years, tied to unrelated crimes, drugs, extortion, other killings. But the heist charge itself proves nearly impossible to make stick against most of the crew, because so many of the men who could testify to it are dead, and those who survive largely refuse to talk. The investigation does not end quietly. Decades later, in 2014, federal prosecutors bring new charges against Vincent Asaro, a reputed Bonanno crime family captain, alleging he was one of the men present inside the cargo building the night of the robbery. It is the first Lufthansa-related prosecution in over 3 decades, built partly on testimony from cooperating witnesses inside organised crime circles, including men who once worked alongside Burke. Asaro goes to trial in 2015. Prosecutors lay out an elaborate case connecting him to the planning of the heist, and to at least one of the later murders tied to covering it up. Then, in November 2015, a jury acquits him on all charges. Asaro walks free, and with that verdict, the last serious criminal prosecution connected directly to the Lufthansa heist collapses. He dies several years later, still the last man publicly accused, and still never convicted. What happened to the $5 million in cash has never been definitively answered. Investigators believe most of it was laundered quickly, spread among crew members, converted through gambling operations, real estate, and cash businesses tied to organised crime in Queens and Brooklyn during the late 70s and early 80s. Some believe Burke kept a disproportionate share, using violence to make sure fewer people had a claim to it. The jewellery taken the same night, worth roughly $1 million on top of the cash, has also never resurfaced in any documented way. No significant portion of either haul has ever been recovered by law enforcement, despite decades of investigation, informant testimony, and one high-profile trial. What remains today is the building itself, long since repurposed. The cargo terminal that once held stacks of West German currency, now operating under different tenants at JFK. What remains is a case file the FBI has never formally closed, one of the longest-running unsolved aspects of any major American robbery. Technically still open because so much of the money, and so many of the details around who ultimately controlled it have never been resolved in court. What remains is a body count, a Hollywood film, a captain who walked free, and a vault that, on one December night in 1978, was emptied in just over an hour by 6 men who knew exactly what they were doing and almost nothing about what would come after. The $5 million has never been found.